Hello and welcome back to Kyoshi Chronicles. We are delving deep into the Forgotten Chain series.
In Episode 1, The Caravans of Silence, we followed the haunting trails that stretched across the vast deserts of Africa. We discovered that for more than 1,000 years, caravans moved silently through the Sahara, carrying one of history's most tragic cargoes: human beings. Men, women, and children were marched across some of the harshest terrain on Earth, bound for distant markets in North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Historical accounts describe slave caravans crossing immense desert routes, where many captives never survived the journey. We learned how villages lived under the constant shadow of fear. A distant cloud of dust on the horizon could signal the arrival of traders, raiders, or armed bands seeking captives. Families were torn apart, communities disappeared. Ancient trade routes that carried gold, salt, and ivory also carried millions of enslaved Africans over the centuries. But the caravans did not begin in the desert. Before the chains, before the long march, before the markets, there was another terrifying chapter. There were the raiders. The caravans could only continue because someone supplied them, someone captured the victims, someone hunted human beings. And that brings us to today's story. Episode 2, Raiders of the Shore. Along the coastlines, riverbanks, and frontier villages of Africa, communities lived with a constant threat. The danger often arrived without warning. Armed raiders struck at dawn or under cover of darkness. Some came by land, others came by sea. Villages that had stood peacefully for generations could be attacked in a single night. The shore became a place of terror. Fishermen launching their boats, children playing near the water, and families living along coastal settlements knew that danger might appear beyond the horizon at any moment. Captives were seized and forced into a system of slavery that stretched across continents. Who were these raiders? How did they operate? Why did entire regions become hunting grounds for human beings? And how did ordinary Africans resist, survive, and fight back?
Join us as we uncover one of the darkest and least discussed chapters of African history. This is Raiders of the Shore. The story begins now.
Hello and welcome back to Kyoshi Chronicles and the Forgotten Chains. This is episode number 2, Raiders of the Shore. For centuries, across vast regions of sub-Saharan Africa, normal people lived with a fear few can imagine today. It was not fear of drought. It was not fear of famine. It was not fear of disease. It was the fear that tomorrow morning, everything they loved could disappear. Imagine going to sleep beside your family, your children safe, your crops growing, your village at peace. Then, before sunrise, the sound of hoofs, the barking of dogs, the screams of neighbors, the crackling of burning roofs, armed men suddenly emerging from the darkness. Within minutes, your world is destroyed, your home burned, your family is scattered, your children vanish into the night. And if you survived, you may never see them again. For millions of Africans, this was not a rare tragedy. It was recurring reality. The slave trade that stretched across deserts, kingdoms, and continents required one thing above all else: human beings. And obtaining those human beings often began with the slave raiders. These were the men who came at dawn, the men whose arrival brought terror, the men who transformed villages into ruins and families into merchandise. We are obligated to tell their story. Chapter 1: The Demand for Human Beings. To understand the raiders, we must first understand the demand. For centuries, Vast commercial networks connected Africa to North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, and beyond. Gold moved across these routes, ivory moved across these routes, salt, and tragically, so did people. Throughout many regions of the Islamic world, enslaved Africans were purchased for a variety of purposes. Some served as domestic workers, others worked on farms and plantations. Some became soldiers, others were employed in construction projects. Many served wealthy households, some entered royal courts, others disappeared into lives about which history records almost nothing. The demand was constant, and where there is demand, suppliers emerged. Traders realized enormous profit could be made by delivering captives to markets. A healthy young laborer could command significant value. A child presented years of future labor. Young women were frequently targeted because they could be sold for multiple purposes. Human beings became commodities, products, assets, inventory. The farther south the trade expanded, the more communities became vulnerable. What began as isolated raids eventually evolved into organized systems stretching across thousands of miles. Entire commercial networks arose around the capture and transportation of people. And at the center of those networks stood the slave raiders. The market demanded captives. The raiders supplied them. Their methods would leave scars across generations. Chapter 2: The Raid. Most raids depend upon a critical advantage: surprise. The ideal attack came before dawn, when villagers slept, when guards were tired, when darkness concealed movement. A village might awaken to barking dogs, then shouting, then panic. Horsemen and camelmen could appear from the horizon with terrifying speed. The regions where cavalry operated, farming communities often had little chance to respond. The attack itself was frequently brutal. Homes were set ablaze, food supplies destroyed, livestock seized. Anyone who resisted risked immediate death. The goal was not conquest, the goal was captives. Men capable of labor, women, children, anyone who could be sold. Chaos served the attackers well. Confusion separated families. Smoke obscured visibility. People fled in different directions. Parents lost sight of children. Brothers lost sisters. Husbands lost wives. Entire families vanished within minutes. For those captured, the nightmare was only beginning. Captives were often bound together, necks chained, wrists tied, groups forced to march. The elderly were frequently abandoned. The weak often struggled to keep pace. Children cried for parents they could no longer find. Parents desperately searched crowds for missing sons and daughters. History is filled with statistics, but behind every number was a face, a voice, a family, a life interrupted forever. Some captives attempted escape. Many failed. Others disappeared into forests, and were never seen again. Yet, thousands upon thousands continued the march, away from home, away from everything familiar, toward an uncertain future. Chapter 3: Living Under Fear. Over time, communities adapted. Survival required change. Villages that once stood openly on fertile land relocated to different terrain. Some moved into mountains, others disappeared deep into forests. Many built walls. Watchtowers emerged. Lookouts scanned horizons daily. Entire settlements recognized themselves around defense. Agriculture suffered. Fields located far from villages became dangerous to cultivate. Trade routes became risky. Travel became limited. Trust began to erode. Neighboring communities sometimes viewed one another with suspicion. Who could be trusted? Who might be cooperating with the raiders? Who might sell information for profit? The uncertainty was devastating. Generations grew up expecting danger. Children learned escape routes before adulthood. Parents taught vigilance alongside farming. Fear became part of daily life, not because raids happen every day, but because they could happen any day. Stories of raids passed from generation to generation. Warning became folklore. Memories became lessons. The fear embedded itself deeply into collective memory. Even communities that avoided direct attack often lived under the shadow of potential violence. The threat alone changed behavior, and over centuries, entire regions were transformed. Chapter 4: The Cycle of Violence. As the trade expanded, another tragedy unfolded. Violence began feeding itself. Some communities remained victims, others became participants. Some rulers resisted the trade, others exploited it. Wars produced prisoners, prisoners became captives, captives generated wealth, wealth purchased weapons, weapons enabled further warfare. The cycle repeated again and again and again. Not every conflict was caused by slavery. African societies had long histories before the trade. They possessed complex political systems, economics, and rivalries. Yet the enormous demand for captives intensifies violence in many regions. Human beings became a currency, and whenever people become currency, moral boundaries begin to erode. The consequences would be felt for centuries. Entire populations were disrupted, communities fractured, economic development slowed, political stability weakened. The effects did not disappear when individual raids ended. They continued to echo across generations. The slave raiders were not merely isolated criminals, they were part of something much larger, a vast commercial system stretching across continents, a system powered by demand, a system sustained by profit, a system that transformed human lives into commodities. For centuries, millions lived under the constant threat of capture. Millions more saw families torn apart, entire societies altered their way of life simply to survive. Today, many people know little about this chapter of history, yet understanding it is essential, not to create hatred, not to assign collective guilt, but to remember those whose voices were never recorded, those who disappeared into caravans, those who never returned home, and those who endured unimaginable suffering. Their story deserves to be told, their memory deserves to be honored, and history deserves to be remembered. And we will continue the process. Next episode: how African kingdoms fought, adapted, resisted, and sometimes participated as the slave trade expanded across the continent, reshaping the destiny of Africa itself. Next episode: Kingdoms Under Siege. Come back to find out how did the kingdoms of Africa responded to these atrocities. Thank you for watching. Please make sure to subscribe, to comment, to like, and to share. This story needs to be told.
But the raiders were only part of the story. As the attacks grew more frequent, entire African kingdoms found themselves facing a terrible choice: resist and risk destruction, or adapt to a world transformed by war and slave raiding. In the next episode, Kingdoms Under Siege, we will enter the courts of kings and the walls of great cities as powerful African states struggle to survive. An age of fear and betrayal. Some kingdoms fought back. Some formed uneasy alliances, and some became entangled in the very trade that threatened their existence. What happens when an entire civilization is forced to choose between survival and morality? The answer may change everything you thought you knew about Africa's past. Join us next time for Episode 3, Kingdoms Under Siege.